Hi guys, and welcome to official chapter 4. This chapter is about combating resistant styles. So hopefully if you've been following the advice from the previous chapters, you're starting to get a bit more aggressive with your play, as long as the people at the table warrant that. If you're getting your 70% of folds, you're playing more aggressively, you're open raising more, you're 3-betting more, and you're c-betting the right boards and c-betting the right amount. So people after a while will get on to what you're doing, and they'll understand the style of play that you're playing. So how do you deal with that? Well, the first thing is to recognise when they've understood how you're playing, and recognise when they're trying to counter your style. When they counter these style, they're going to be 3-betting you because they know you fold to 3-bets a lot. But they're also going to be calling your raises and calling your 3-bets and floating flops. That's a very good sort of strategy, not for us to play, but for people to play against us when we're playing this style. So how do we deal with that? Well, the first thing is to be aware that they're going to call a bit more, so you might want to just tighten up a little bit. But also, in a situation where you've, say, raised and they've 3-bet, or that you've where you've raised and they've called, or you've 3-bet them and they've called, then be careful with your c-betting. Don't necessarily go and automatically c-bet the dry flops like I've been saying before. Against the players that are likely to call and to float you, they're quite a very solid strategy against me would be to call on the flop, wait for me to shut down and try and take it away on the turn. And that works very effectively against me. But when I notice people doing that, then I have to change what I do. So I'm not c-betting so much when I miss. But when I check, instead of continuation betting, straight away they smell a rat, because they're saying, well, Graham always c-bets dry boards. Why isn't he continuation betting? He must have something. And they're just check behind. Because most of the time in these situations, you're going to be out of position, because if they're a good player and they've called you, they're probably going to be calling you when they're in position more often than not. Not necessarily, but more often than not. So don't just continuation bet, even if it's a dry flop, against players that are doing this. If you can get away with it and people are folding flop all the time, that's fine. Actually keep the strategy going. But when people are playing a resistant style, you may well find that they just call you pre-flop and they call the flop bet, and then they wait for you to check and they take it down on the turn. So check when you've missed against these players, when you see them doing this. Now, if you've hit, you just bet as normal, because they're not going to believe you anyway, and they're probably going to call. And if you're out of position and then the turn comes a brick, I'd actually recommend checking, because effectively when you've got something, when you've got a good hand, you made top pair or better, or you've got an overpair or whatever, to check on brick turns, because they're almost certainly going to have a bet, because their whole strategy is that they're floating the flops to try and take it on the turn. They call it float to take. The float is the call, and then the take is the bet on the next street. So you can check raise them in this situation, and then they're going to be in a whole world of pain, because they're like, what's gone on here? He's supposed to just give up when he checks the turn, and he's check raised me. So that's a way of dealing with conflicting styles. And I'm one of the few players that doesn't mind too much being out of position. Now, if any full-time poker player or professional poker player tells you that they don't rate position much, then they completely get sort of like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about or whatever. But there are some advantages to being out of position. This move on the turn I've just talked about, where you can bet the flop and then check raise the turn when you've got it, you can't do that when you're in position. You can only check behind and try it on the next street. So, and also, if say you've got a situation where you've bet the flop, bet the turn, and you've been called a couple of times, and you've got overpair or something, and then it's a draw heavy board, and then when you're out of position, you can sometimes check the river, so that it induces the bluff on the draw that they've missed, or pot control if they've been slow playing a set or something like that against you. So being out of position on the river, you can check to induce the bluff, and you can't check to induce a bluff on the river if you're in position, because that would complete the action of the hand. So there are some benefits to being out of position. And I quite rate a lot of these benefits. As I say, I've got an alternative sort of playing style to most, as you know. And of course, it's better to be in position. I'm not for one moment suggesting that you start playing loads of pots out of position. But what I'm saying is there are benefits that you get from being out of position that you don't get in position. Obviously, the benefits of being in position are better, but when you're in a pot out position, think about how you can use that to your advantage. Okay. I'll just look at what. Yeah. So, and the other thing is that quite often you hear about talking about Nash calling ranges, and people are very much sort of playing to specific ranges. Now, I don't really have. I mean, I jokingly right here. I don't know if you can see it. Graham's pre-flop calling range, based on initial position and my position, and the answer is never. We're not calling pre-flop ever. So and you get quite often people that say, oh, these are the Nash calling ranges, for example, and I don't think John Nash would be very happy with that, to be honest, because the situation is far too complex to sort of, to say about, what you can prove game theory sort of heads up with a shove or fold stack, and things can be simulated by computer for sure. But in a multi-table, deep sort of a poker game, to say that there's particular calling ranges in certain positions and that they're Nash ranges, really they're kind of people's or sites' opinions. That's my opinion anyway. I mean, other people may disagree with that, but so. The one thing that I would say with your continuation bets, and I alluded to it a bit in one of the other videos, is that you assess how likely your C-bet is going to get through based on the position of your raised and the position that you've called in. If you're called like in the big blind, they're likely to have more rag aces, more low suited connectors in their hand. If you're called on the button or the cutoff, they're likely to have more Broadway cards in their hand and medium low pocket pairs. So obviously, you can still have Broadway cards in the big blind, but they're also playing lots of other hands, the rag aces, the suited connectors, the double gappers, and they might defend their blind quite wide anyway. So if you've got a flop that's just a queen high flop with, say, a deuce and a 7 queen, then it's probably more likely that your C-bet's going to get through against the big blind than it is against the guy that's called on the button or on the cutoff. And if it's a really low flop, then you might want to be careful with the big blind, because that's that might hit his range. I'm not saying don't continuation bet, but just have this awareness about how a flop may suit your opponent based on you're the one that's been the aggressor. But based on what your position was, if you raised like on the button, they might call you very wide in the big blind. If you've raised under the gun, they might not call quite so wide. Quite so wide. If you raised under the gun and got called in the cutoff's probably not going to have a low suited connector hand. He'd probably let that go. But he's got a lot of Broadway cards and a lot of medium low pocket pairs in his hand. More so than perhaps the big blind would have. So just take into consideration your position when you've raised and the position that they've called you in as to what their range might be. And secondly, if you've 3-bet and it's been called, then obviously you're in quite a powerful position, because your hand is weighted towards monsters. They're going to be very worried about ace, king, queen, and ace, king. They're going to be very worried about the high pocket pairs. So quite often your continuation bet doesn't need to be as large if it's a 3-bet pot, because of 2 reasons. One, it's already a bloated pot. And 2, that you will have them very worried because you 3-bet that you have got a monster hand. So, and when they've called 3-bets, they're more likely to have sort of Broadway cards, pocket pairs, high ace sort of X hands than they are the suited connectors. They may have suited connectors, like if you're 100 big blinds deep, they're absolutely fine to call you 3-bet with suited connectors. But when you're not very deep, they're probably not going to be calling your 3-bets with suited connectors typically. So just have a little bit of an awareness of that. But this chapter is mainly about combating resistant styles. When people are onto us, so to speak, they're like, right, I know you Stayorgo, you 3-bet light, you raise all the time, I'm going to be 3-betting against you, and I'm going to be floating you, calling you, floating your flops. When we recognise this happen, we have to change our strategy slightly. Okay, so I hope this is useful. And if you have got people, but particularly if they're 3-betting you light pre-flop because they know that you're opening wide, then you just have to, when they're still to act after you, you just have to ease off a bit if they're still to act after you. But so you just tighten your range up in that regard. So yeah, absolutely, especially people watching these coaching sites. I've already had some comments about saying, well, now everyone knows how you play, so you know they're going to be 3-betting you all the time. And I'm like, yeah, I know, but most of the regs know me anyway. They know my style, and yeah, for sure they will 3-bet me, but light. But if I notice that happening, I'm going to tighten up, or I might 4-bet a bit wider than normally against them. And also I'm going to be aware of people using this calling strategy and floating flop strategy. So you're forever sort of evolving it, but if you're getting success from the way that you're playing and all the time you can get away with it, if you're not known very well and that the strategy's working, just apply it. But look out for these resistant styles that will try to counter your play. Recognise when they happen and then change your game accordingly, so that you then counter their counter, so to speak. So best of luck, and I hope everything's working fine and you're not coming up against much resistance. But if and when you do, then this chapter may help. All the best, guys. Cheers.